Cancel your wedding. My late grandmother warned me in a visceral dream the night before I walked down the aisle. Wake up immediately, drive to your future mother-in-law's estate, and see the absolute truth. I drove through the thick fog with my heart pounding. Stepping inside that silent mansion and creeping toward the study, the sight waiting behind those heavy oak doors changed my life forever. My name is Clara, 33 years old, and until 48 hours ago I thought I was marrying the man of my dreams. I spent the last decade building my career as a forensic auditor. I trace missing money for a living. I hunt down hidden assets and expose liars. Yet the biggest fraud of my life was sleeping right next to me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust betrayed by the person you loved most. Brendan was 35, a venture capitalist who supposedly came from generations of untouchable wealth. His family was the definition of East Coast elite, none more so than his mother Sylvia. From the moment Brendan introduced me to her, Sylvia made it clear my success meant nothing. I tolerated her insults because I truly believed Brendan loved me. I was completely wrong. It started with the dream. It was exactly 3:45 in the morning on a Thursday, 2 days before our lavish wedding. I was tossing and turning in the massive bed of the downtown penthouse we leased together. Suddenly, my Nana Rose was standing at the foot of the bed. She built a massive packaging empire before passing away 5 years ago. She taught me to trust numbers because numbers never lie. In the dream, her face was stern, her eyes blazing with an intense urgency. Cancel your wedding, Clara, her voice echoed in the silent room. Wake up right now. Drive to Sylvia's house. You will see exactly who they are. I jolted awake, gasping for air. The sheets were soaked in cold sweat. I looked over at Brendan's side of the bed only to find it empty. His phone and keys were missing. A note on his nightstand read, "Could not sleep, went to the gym, love you." Normally I would have gone right back to sleep. But my forensic mind latched onto the warning. Nana Rose had never steered me wrong, and the sheer terror gripping my chest told me not to ignore her. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and ran out. The drive to Sylvia's sprawling estate took 30 minutes. The streets were quiet, shrouded in a thick fog that matched the heavy dread sitting in my stomach. The sharp instinct that made me a top auditor was screaming at me. Something was fundamentally wrong with my life. I parked 2 blocks down from Sylvia's iron gates. I kept my headlights off. I knew the access code to the pedestrian side gate because Brendan gave it to me months ago. I punched in the numbers. The heavy metal clicked open. As I slipped through the manicured hedges, I noticed how unkempt the side gardens had actually become. The white paint on the window trim was peeling significantly. In the harsh light of dawn, the grand illusion of flawless wealth was visibly cracking. I had the spare key to the kitchen door tucked in my pocket. I slipped it into the lock, turning it with agonizing slowness. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dark kitchen. The house was dead silent. I crept down the long hallway, making no sound. I was about to turn around when I saw a thin sliver of warm light spilling out from beneath the heavy oak doors of Sylvia's private study. And then I heard the voices. It was not just Brendan and Sylvia in that room. There was a third voice. A young woman's voice, sharp, demanding, and laced with absolute venom. "I am not waiting another month, Brendan," the unknown woman hissed. "You promised me this would be settled by the time the baby was born. He is 3 months old now. I want my money, or I am walking right into that rehearsal dinner tomorrow and blowing this wide open." My breath hitched violently in my throat. I pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall, creeping inches closer to the slight gap in the heavy double doors. I held my breath and peered through the narrow crack. There was Brendan, running a stressed hand through his hair. Standing next to him was Sylvia, her face twisted in a sneer of pure disgust. Sitting in the leather armchair across from them was a blonde woman I had never seen before. In her arms, wrapped tightly in a pale blue blanket, was a sleeping infant, a baby boy. My heart stopped beating. The world around me seemed to shatter. The man who kissed my forehead 3 hours ago, the man who promised to start a family with me, was standing in his mother's study, negotiating with a secret mistress and a hidden child. "Keep your voice down, Tara." Brendan snapped his face, contorting into an ugly expression. You think I want to be marrying this stuck-up middle-class calculator? I have to do this. We have no other choice if we want to survive. I froze in place. I did not cry. I did not gasp. In that exact fraction of a second, the loving, hopeful bride inside me died completely. The warm woman who wanted a beautiful future was instantly replaced by someone else entirely. The cold, calculating auditor took the wheel, and I prepared to burn their entire lives to the ground. I turned around and walked out of that house knowing that by this time tomorrow, they would all pay the ultimate price for their profound betrayal. I was ready. I turned to walk away, ready to disappear. But my training kicked in. A forensic auditor never leaves a crime scene without evidence. I stopped my breathing, slow and controlled. I pulled my phone from my pocket with absolute precision. My hands stopped shaking. The betrayal was so immense it bypassed my emotions entirely and hit my logic directly. I opened my voice memo app Hit Record and held the device close to the crack in the heavy oak doors. I was not leaving until I had every detail of their scheme captured in crystal clear audio. You have been saying that for over a year, Brendan. Tara shot back. She adjusted the baby pacing across the Persian rug. He whimpered. Sylvia shot them a look of absolute revulsion, clutching her silk robe tighter around her thin frame. Oh, do keep that child quiet, Sylvia sneered. Her voice dripped with the signature elitist disgust she usually reserved for me. You are getting exactly what was promised to you, Tara. But you need patience. Clara's trust fund unlocks the moment the marriage certificate is signed. Do you understand the sheer magnitude of what we are dealing with here? My grandmother's trust. They knew exactly how it was structured. $5 million, Brendan said, his voice dripping with naked greed. Nana Rose left her $5 million in a liquid trust that automatically merges into our joint accounts the second we are legally bound. I have already set up the offshore shell company. The second the ink dries on that marriage license, I am sweeping those funds. We pay off the IRS, we clear the foreclosure on this house, and you get your $1 million to disappear to California. Everyone wins. Except Clara. Tara smirked. She leaned back into the leather armchair looking incredibly satisfied. What happens when your brilliant little auditor realizes her accounts have been drained? Let her cry. Sylvia laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that made my blood boil. The girl is so desperate for validation, so eager to be part of our family, she will not suspect a thing until it is far too late. By the time she realizes the money is gone, we will file for an annulment based on irreconcilable differences. The funds will be untraceable. She is smart with numbers, yes, but she is utterly blinded by love. It is pathetic, really. Brendan walked to Sylvia's mahogany desk and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something rapidly, tore the check away, and handed it to Tara. Here, $20,000. This is to cover your silence for the next 48 hours. Buy whatever you need for the kid. But if you show your face near my wedding, you get absolutely nothing. Do we have a deal? Tara snatched the paper, inspecting the zeros with a greedy glint in her eyes. Fine. 48 hours, Brendan. After that, I want the full $1 million wired to my account immediately. Through the crack in the door, my eyes locked onto the design of the paper Tara was holding. It was not Sylvia's personal checkbook. It was the distinct navy blue corporate checkbook from my auditing firm. Brendan had stolen one of my blank company checks. He was paying off his mistress and his secret child using the money I earned working grueling 80-hour weeks. We would not even be in this mess if your father had not gambled away our entire estate, Sylvia muttered bitterly. She poured herself a tall glass of bourbon despite the early hour. 3 years we have been hiding from the IRS. 3 years of pretending we still have wealth, dodging aggressive creditors, and keeping up appearances at the country club. This wedding is our final salvation. Clara is nothing but a temporary, necessary inconvenience. I know, Mother. Brendan sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I have played the perfect loving fiancé for 2 agonizing years. I have listened to her drone on about her boring audits and her dead grandmother. I have fully earned this payout. Just keep your mouth shut at the rehearsal dinner tonight, Tara. Let me secure the bag. I had heard enough. I had the entire vile confession recorded in perfect, undeniable audio. I quietly tapped the stop button on my phone and instantly saved the digital file to 3 secure cloud servers. The Clara who walked into this house 30 minutes ago, the joyful woman who wanted to pick out floral arrangements and argue about seating charts, was gone forever. I slowly backed away from the door, retracing my steps through the dark hallway. I did not bump into any tables. I did not make a single sound on the marble floors. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was cold and sharp. I slipped out the kitchen door, locked it securely behind me, and walked back to my car through the heavy fog. When I finally sat down in the driver's seat, I gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. They thought I was just a desperate middle-class girl eager for their social validation. They genuinely thought my love for Brendan made me stupid. They completely forgot what I did for a living. I did not just look at numbers. I actively dismantled entire lives based on financial discrepancies. And Brendan had just unknowingly handed me the golden keys to his own destruction. There was no time for tears. The luxurious rehearsal dinner was tonight. The massive wedding was tomorrow. I had exactly 12 hours to completely dismantle an entire fake family, protect my $5 million trust, and trap Brendan in a federal financial crime. I started the car and pulled away from the curb. The sun was just beginning to break through the fog, casting long shadows across the empty road. I did not drive back to the penthouse I shared with Brendan. I drove straight to my downtown office. It was time to do an audit. At 6 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of my downtown auditing firm were unlocked. The entire office was completely empty, dark, and perfectly still. I walked past the reception desk, past the large glass conference rooms where I had previously dismantled massive corporate fraud cases, and locked myself inside my private office. I booted up my encrypted workstation. My mind was operating at 1,000 miles an hour. Every single financial excuse Brendan had ever made over the last 2 years flashed through my head with sickening clarity. My assets are tied up in a venture capital hold, babe. Can you cover the lease on the penthouse this year? Sylvia needs to borrow your car because hers is waiting for parts. Let us use your accounts for the wedding vendors, since my trust distribution does not hit until next quarter. It had all been a calculated, methodical, perfectly executed lie. I pulled up the secure banking software linking all my personal and corporate accounts. I started running complex queries flagging every single transaction Brendan had ever touched. He had a supplementary card on my secondary business account. I rarely monitored it because it was strictly for miscellaneous office expenses and petty cash. I ran a forensic trace on that specific card. The results populated on my dual monitors, and my jaw tightened instantly as the ugly truth revealed itself in columns of red numbers. Over the last 6 months, Brendan had not just been stealing the occasional check for Tara, he had been executing dozens of microtransactions. $2,000 here, $4,000 there. They were categorized under fake vendor names like Apex Marketing, Harbor Consulting, and Cascade Supplies. I cross-referenced the limited liability companies through the state business database. They were all shell companies registered to a generic agent in Delaware. Brendan was not as smart as he thought he was. He had used his own personal computer network to file the initial incorporation paperwork. The Internet Protocol address traced directly back to our shared penthouse. He was siphoning my corporate funds directly into offshore accounts to slowly pay off the aggressive tax collectors pursuing his mother while funneling cash to Tara to keep her quiet. This was not just a bad breakup or a terrible emotional betrayal. This was serious federal wire fraud. I immediately dialed the direct line of my private wealth manager at the bank. Anthony, I said, bypassing the standard pleasantries as soon as he answered. I need an immediate freeze on all secondary corporate accounts. I also need you to sever the automatic trust integration trigger that was set for tomorrow upon the filing of my marriage certificate. Keep the trust completely isolated under my sole authority. Clara, it is your wedding weekend. Is everything okay? Anthony asked, clearly alarmed by my urgent tone. Everything is perfectly fine, I replied to him very coldly. I also need you to initiate a quiet withdrawal from the joint wedding account I share with Brendan. Drain it. Leave exactly $200 in it. $200. Clara, the final catering check for the rehearsal dinner is tied to that account. It is going to bounce. I know, I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. That is the entire point. Just execute the transfers, Anthony. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The financial trap was officially set. But I needed more ammunition. I needed to know exactly how deep Sylvia's financial ruin truly went. I accessed a specialized federal database used by forensic auditors to pull property tax records and lien notices. Sylvia's massive, sprawling estate, the exact one she constantly lorded over me as proof of their superior breeding, was heavily mortgaged. They were 3 months behind on multiple payments. The federal tax authority had placed a massive lien on the property for unpaid back taxes. Sylvia was literally weeks away from having the commercial bank seize the estate and throw her out onto the cold street. My $5 million trust fund was their only lifeline. They were going to use my grandmother's hard-earned money to save their pathetic, crumbling facade of wealth. Suddenly, a heavy knock echoed against my frosted glass office door. I quickly minimized the spreadsheets on my monitors. "Come in," I called out, my guard instantly up. The door opened, and Jamal walked in. Jamal was Brendan's brother-in-law, married to his sister, Rebecca. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man who worked as a senior architect. He was always the quietest person at Sylvia's suffocating family dinners, mostly because Sylvia treated him with the same barely concealed disdain she reserved for me. Jamal was smart, observant, and fiercely protective of his own peace. We had always shared a quiet solidarity as the two outsiders trapped in the elite family circle. He closed the heavy glass door behind him and locked it securely. He did not smile. He did not offer a polite wedding greeting. He walked straight over to my desk, reached into his coat pocket, and placed a small silver flash drive right on top of my keyboard. "I thought you might need this," Jamal said, his voice low and incredibly serious, "before you make the absolute biggest mistake of your entire life." I stared at the silver drive, then looked up at him. "Jamal, what is this?" He leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on my desk. "I see the way you look at the numbers, Clara. I know you are a brilliant auditor, but you have been completely blind when it comes to Brendan. I have not. I have been digging through their home office for weeks. Sylvia and Brendan are not just broke. They are actively destroying everyone around them to stay afloat. And you are their final payday." I sat frozen, staring at the flash drive resting on my keyboard. My mind raced, calculating the variables of Jamal's sudden appearance. I had always liked him. He was the only person in that family who did not treat me like an automated teller machine. But in the dangerous world of forensic auditing, blind trust was a massive liability. "Why are you bringing this to me now, Jamal?" I asked carefully. "You are married to Rebecca. You are tied to their family. If Brendan and Sylvia go down for financial crimes, your wife goes down with them." Jamal let out a bitter laugh. He pulled out a guest chair and sat heavily. "Rebecca is already going down, Clara. Sylvia made sure of that." He pointed a firm finger at the drive. "Plug it in. See for yourself." I picked up the silver drive, scanned it on a virtual machine, and opened the folder. My eyes widened as the hidden documents loaded. It was a horrifying documented trail of identity theft. "They ruined her," Jamal said, his voice thick with rage. "Sylvia forced Rebecca to co-sign on predatory loans to keep the estate afloat. When Rebecca refused to sign the fourth, Sylvia and Brendan forged her signature. They maxed out credit lines in my wife's name. They funneled the cash to dodge tax liens. Rebecca's credit is destroyed. We tried to buy a house and the bank laughed us out. Sylvia used her daughter as a shield." I scrolled through the forged documents. The signatures were clumsy and desperate. "Does Rebecca know?" I asked softly. "She knows," Jamal nodded. "But she is so brainwashed by Sylvia's manipulation that she refuses to press charges. She keeps saying it is for the family legacy. I am done protecting their name, Clara. I love my wife, but I refuse to let Sylvia and Brendan drag another innocent woman into their graveyard." Jamal leaned forward with intense urgency. "Brendan is not who you think he is. There is a woman named Tara." "I know," I interrupted him, my voice devoid of emotion. Jamal blinked, clearly taken aback. "You know about Tara? And the baby?" "I know about the baby. I know about the $1 million payout. I know about the offshore shell companies Brendan set up to siphon money from my firm." I know they plan to drain my trust the second we sign the marriage license. I turned my monitor around so Jamal could see the massive spreadsheet of wire fraud I had mapped out. I found out at 4 o'clock this morning. Jamal stared at the screen, an impressed smile spreading across his face. He let out a low whistle. I came here to warn a helpless victim. I did not realize I was walking into a war room. I am nobody's victim, Jamal, I said, closing the laptop. I am an auditor, and Brendan's books are about to be balanced. So what is the exact play here? Jamal asked, sitting back in his chair. You cancel the wedding right now. Call the police. No, I replied, my mind already executing the trap. If I call the police now, Brendan will spin it. Sylvia will hire defense attorneys, hide behind the family name, and claim the shell companies were mistakes. Tara will take her baby and vanish. I need them backed into a corner where they cannot lie their way out. I need them to fall publicly in front of the high society crowd they have been trying to impress. I need to shatter their entire reality. I looked at Jamal with serious intent. But I need your help to execute this. If I do this at the altar tomorrow, I need federal law enforcement standing at the back of the room the moment the financial evidence drops. Jamal did not hesitate for a second. I have a college buddy who works as an investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I already sent him copies of the forged loans Sylvia took out in Rebecca's name. If I give him your wire fraud evidence, he will have enough probable cause to secure federal arrest warrants by tomorrow morning. Do it, I said, sliding the printed dossier of Brendan's shell company transfers across the desk. Give him absolutely everything. Tell him to have federal agents at the Plaza Hotel tomorrow at exactly 2 in the afternoon. But Jamal, they cannot move in until I drop the presentation on the screens. I want Brendan and Sylvia to feel invincible right up until the exact moment the handcuffs click on their wrists. Consider it done, Jamal said, taking the file. He stood up, looking at me with profound respect. You know Sylvia always called you new money. She meant it as a terrible insult. I know, I smiled sharply. But the great thing about new money, Jamal, is that we actually know how to count it. He laughed a rich sound and headed for the door. I will see you at the rehearsal dinner tonight, Clara. I would not miss this performance for the world. After Jamal left my office, I spent the next 4 hours finalizing the financial lockdown. I secured my trust, redirected my corporate assets into protected holding accounts, and confirmed the automatic bounce on the joint wedding account. The massive catering check for tonight's extravagant rehearsal dinner was going to fail spectacularly. At noon, I left the office and drove straight back to the luxury penthouse. When I walked through the front door, Brendan was sitting on the velvet couch reviewing the seating chart. He looked up at me, flashing that fake smile that used to make my heart melt. There is my beautiful bride, he said, standing up and pulling me into a tight hug. I hugged him back, resting my chin on his broad shoulder so he could not see the dead look in my eyes. I inhaled the familiar scent of his expensive cologne, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I cannot wait for tomorrow, I whispered softly into his ear. It is going to be a day your entire family will never ever forget. Brendan pulled away from our embrace, completely oblivious to the massive trap closing around him. He smiled his signature charming smile, kissed my forehead lightly, and grabbed his expensive leather golf bag resting by the door. I am hitting the links with the groomsmen for a few hours, he announced casually. Try to get some rest this afternoon, Clara. You look a little exhausted. I will see you tonight at the country club for the rehearsal dinner. I nodded, maintaining my mask of perfect bridal bliss. Have fun, I replied softly. The heavy penthouse door clicked shut behind him. The moment the lock engaged, the fake smile melted off my face. I had survived the initial encounter, but the war was far from over. I walked over to the kitchen island, opened my briefcase, and pulled out my heavily encrypted work laptop. The initial audit I ran earlier with Jamal was just a surface-level scan to confirm the betrayal and secure the arrest warrants. Now, I needed to build the presentation that would destroy them socially. I needed the deep, undeniable proof that would be broadcast on the massive screens at our wedding reception. I logged into the secure federal financial database, using my senior auditor credentials. The investigation into Brendan's actual financial footprint began in earnest. I started with his employment records. Brendan always claimed to be a highly successful venture capitalist. I pulled the tax filings for his firm. The results were instantly pathetic. Brendan was not a partner. He was not even a senior associate. He was an independent contractor who had not successfully closed a single legitimate business deal in over 3 years. His entire career was a carefully constructed mirage designed to manipulate me into believing he was my financial equal. I dug deeper into the corporate registry. The venture capital firm he supposedly worked for was quietly dissolved 24 months ago. He had been getting dressed up and going to a rented co-working space every single day just to keep up the elaborate illusion. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated a trace on the offshore shell companies we identified earlier. I needed to know exactly where my stolen money was sitting. I ran the routing numbers through the international banking clearing system. The digital trail led away from Delaware and bounced through a series of anonymous servers before finally landing in a private account based in the Cayman Islands. I accessed the International Property Registry and cross-referenced the corporate officers of the Cayman account. There it was. The sole beneficiary of the offshore account was Sylvia. She was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Brendan was just the eager foot soldier executing her fraudulent orders. The stolen corporate funds from my auditing firm were sitting in an account waiting to be wired directly to the federal tax authority to clear the massive lien on her estate. But I was not going to let a single penny of my money save that toxic woman. I highlighted the Cayman routing numbers and drafted a formal freeze request to the International Banking Authority. By flagging the account for suspected wire fraud and money laundering, I ensured the funds were instantly locked down. Sylvia would not be able to withdraw a single dime. I pivoted my investigation to Tara. If I was going to expose this family completely, I needed to know exactly who Brendan's mistress was and how she fit into their desperate financial puzzle. I ran a comprehensive background check using the $20,000 check Brendan had written her. I traced the deposit to a small regional bank account in Tara's name. Her financial history painted a clear picture of a woman constantly living beyond her means. She had massive credit card debt, 2 repossessed vehicles, and a history of short-term employment. Brendan had targeted someone he thought he could easily manipulate with the promise of a massive payout. I accessed the public birth records database in our county. I found the birth certificate for the 3-month-old baby boy I saw in Sylvia's study. The father was not listed on the official document, but the child's last name was legally registered with Brendan's family name. It was the final undeniable piece of concrete evidence. I meticulously compiled every single document, every forged signature, every wire transfer receipt, and the damning birth certificate into a single devastating digital presentation. I formatted the slides with bright, highly visible graphics. I made sure the offshore account numbers and the forged loan documents were impossible to misunderstand. I wanted the 300 elite guests at our wedding to see exactly who they were dealing with. There would be no room for spin. I spent the next 3 hours rehearsing the exact timing of the financial presentation. By 5, my masterwork was finished. I stared at the glowing screen. The dossier was an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was airtight, legally binding, and socially lethal. The federal investigators had the raw data for the criminal arrests, but this presentation was specifically designed for the court of public opinion. I saved the final file to a secure flash drive and slipped it carefully into my designer clutch. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Sylvia. "The rehearsal dinner begins at 7 sharp, Clara. Please do not be late. We have a strict schedule to maintain, and I expect you to dress appropriately for our distinguished guests." I read the condescending message and let out a cold laugh. She was still trying to control me entirely, unaware that I held the digital trigger that would obliterate her entire world. I stood up, walked into our massive walk-in closet, and selected a stunning tailored crimson dress. I applied makeup, hiding exhaustion under foundation. I practiced my warm, oblivious bridal smile in the mirror until it looked completely genuine. I grabbed my clutch and headed out the door. I pulled into the pristine, manicured driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club at 6:45. The evening air was cool, but inside my chest a fire was raging. The valet opened my door and I stepped out onto the cobblestone path. I walked through the grand mahogany doors of the club holding my head high and wearing the perfect sweet expression of a bride ready to unite two families. I entered the private dining hall. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a warm glow over round tables decorated with white roses, heavy silver cutlery, and custom linen. 30 of Brendan and Sylvia's closest friends and family members were already gathered sipping vintage champagne and talking softly in that hushed, arrogant tone that only old money seems to master. As soon as I walked in, Sylvia turned around. She was wearing a deep navy silk gown adorned with a pearl necklace that I now knew was heavily mortgaged. Her face instantly hardened into that familiar dismissive expression. "Ah, Clara," she said loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "You finally made it. We were beginning to think you had lost your way." I smiled warmly, walking directly toward her. "Traffic was a bit heavy, Sylvia. But I would not miss this for the world. You look absolutely radiant tonight." Sylvia narrowed her eyes slightly, clearly surprised by my unusually confident tone, but she quickly recovered her polished facade. "Yes, well, appearance is everything in our social circle, something you will need to learn quickly once you wear our family name." She turned to the waiter standing nearby with a tray of silver champagne flutes. "Bring our bride a glass of the Prosecco." She made sure to emphasize the word Prosecco while sipping her expensive vintage champagne. It was a subtle, pathetic attempt to put me in my place. I simply took the glass, smiled, and gave a gentle nod. "Thank you, Sylvia. Your attention to detail is truly remarkable." Brendan appeared at my side a moment later, wrapped an arm around my waist and kissed my cheek. "You look incredible, babe," he whispered. I smiled up at him, resisting the overwhelming urge to pull away. "I have been thinking about us all day, Brendan," I said, looking right into his deceitful eyes. "I cannot wait until tomorrow when everything is finalized." He grinned, completely misinterpreting my statement as starry-eyed adoration. "It is going to be perfect, Clara. Trust me." Jamal and Rebecca were standing near the corner of the room. Jamal made brief eye contact with me, giving a barely perceptible nod to signal that his friend at the Federal Financial Enforcement Agency was fully looped in and preparing the necessary legal warrants. Rebecca looked pale and stressed, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I felt a sudden sharp sting of sympathy for her. She was a genuine victim in this room, crushed under the weight of her mother's relentless narcissism and financial greed. At 7:15, the club's general manager, a tall man in a tailored tuxedo named Mr. Vance, stepped into the dining room. He looked noticeably flustered. His eyes scanned the room rapidly until they landed on Sylvia and Brendan. He cleared his throat and walked over to our table with a stiff, unnatural posture. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mr. Vance said softly, leaning down toward Sylvia. "Might I have a quick word with you and Brendan in private regarding the account for tonight's event?" Sylvia raised an eyebrow, looking offended by the interruption. "Mr. Vance, we are in the middle of our rehearsal dinner. Whatever administrative detail you need can surely wait until Monday morning." "I am afraid it cannot, Mrs. Montgomery," Mr. Vance replied, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to maintain discretion. "The corporate credit card provided on file for the deposit and final catering balance was declined a few moments ago. We attempted to process the remaining balance twice, but the system returned an immediate error." Sylvia's face turned bright red. Her regal composure cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing the sheer panic underneath. "That is absurd," she snapped, keeping her voice in a harsh whisper. "That card has an unlimited line of credit. Your payment terminal must be malfunctioning." "I assure you, our terminals are working perfectly," Mr. Vance said calmly, maintaining a cold, professional boundary. "We also attempted to clear the backup check provided by Brendan earlier this week. The bank returned it due to insufficient funds." Brendan's jaw dropped. His face went completely pale. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen as he tried to access his banking application. I watched him closely, enjoying every single second of his internal collapse. He was staring at the joint wedding account I had drained earlier that morning, the account that now held exactly $200. "This is a mistake," Brendan stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "There is a massive technical glitch with the bank system." Clara, sweetheart, can you step over here for a second? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, stepped closer to the group, and tilted my head in total innocent confusion. Is something wrong, Brendan? There seems to be an issue with the event payment, Brendan said, trying desperately to keep his voice calm so the nearby guests would not hear. The joint account is showing an unexpected clearance hold. Could you quickly put your corporate card down to cover the dinner balance? It is just $12,000. I will fix the bank glitch first thing in the morning and wire the money straight back to you. I looked at Brendan, then looked at Sylvia, whose eyes were wide with a mix of panic and utter humiliation. I let out a soft, gentle sigh, making sure my voice carried just enough for the surrounding tables to hear the awkward tension. "Oh, Brendan," I said, my voice ringing clear and sweet across the dining room. "My corporate accounts are completely locked down for our weekend. And besides, I thought your family always insisted on paying for the rehearsal dinner. It is a firm Montgomery tradition, is it not?" The silence following my innocent question was deafening. The surrounding guests, previously deep in hushed conversations about summer homes and stock portfolios, stopped talking completely. Every single eye at the adjacent tables turned to look directly at our group. Sylvia looked like she had been struck by physical lightning, her perfectly powdered face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly without a single sound coming out. Brendan swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down the side of his neck. "Clara, please," he hissed, his voice cracking under the intense public pressure. "Let us not discuss family finances in front of the club management. Just put your card down and we will sort this out in the morning." I smiled warmly, tilting my head with an expression of pure, unadulterated concern. "But I cannot, sweetheart," I replied, my voice steady and completely clear. "As I just mentioned, my corporate accounts are frozen for the wedding weekend to prevent security breaches while we travel. Surely a $12,000 dinner is just a drop in the bucket for the Montgomery estate. You always told me your family endowment was entirely untouchable." Mr. Vance cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "Sir, we require a valid form of payment immediately, or I will be forced to stop the kitchen service and ask your guests to leave the premises." The sheer humiliation radiating from Sylvia was intoxicating. For 2 years, she had made me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of their prestigious bloodline. Now, in front of her most judgmental peers, her fraudulent empire was cracking wide open. Brendan frantically patted his pockets, pulling out a silver money clip holding barely $200 in cash. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes finally landing on his furious mother. Sylvia, entirely defeated and shaking with silent fury, unclasped the heavy diamond tennis bracelet from her right wrist. She practically shoved it into the general manager's chest. "Keep this in the club safe overnight," she spat venomously. "It is worth $60,000. I will return tomorrow with a certified check to retrieve it. Now go away and serve our guests before I have the board of directors terminate your employment immediately." Mr. Vance inspected the bracelet, nodded stiffly, and walked away. The crisis was temporarily averted, but the damage was permanently done. Whispers erupted across the dining room as guests exchanged knowing, scandalous looks. Sylvia grabbed her champagne glass and downed the entire vintage in one gulp, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Excuse me for a moment," I said sweetly, standing up from the table. "I need to visit the powder room to freshen up." I walked away slowly, maintaining a graceful, unbothered posture. But the moment I pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the private lounge outside the restrooms, my sweet smile vanished. I pulled my phone from my clutch and immediately opened my encrypted banking application. I needed to execute the next phase of the financial chokehold. During my deep dive audit earlier that morning, I discovered that Brendan had automated his theft. He had set up a recurring wire transfer system through my firm's secondary accounting software. Every Friday at 8 in the evening, a digital script automatically siphoned $2,000 from my business operating account and deposited it into the Delaware shell company he controlled. Tonight was Friday. The scheduled transfer was pending in my outgoing queue, set to execute in exactly 14 minutes. I clicked on the pending transaction details. The beneficiary was listed as Harbor Consulting Limited. It was the primary shell entity Brendan used to wash my stolen money before sending it offshore to Sylvia's Cayman account. But as I reviewed the ledger on my screen, I noticed a secondary connected transaction. Brendan had queued an outgoing wire from that shell company directly to Tara's regional bank account. It was the remaining balance of her hush money scheduled to clear just hours before our wedding ceremony tomorrow afternoon. I was using my automated accounting software to pay off his mistress, while he stood in the other room pretending to be my devoted fiancé. The absolute audacity of it made my pulse race. I tapped the screen and permanently deleted the recurring script. I canceled the pending wire transfer from my operating account. Then, utilizing my administrative access to the compromised shell company portal, I initiated a total freeze on Harbor Consulting Limited. I watched the screen load for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a green confirmation box appeared. The shell company was completely dead. The account was locked, and the pending wire to Tara was officially voided. By tomorrow morning, Tara was going to wake up, check her bank balance, and realize Brendan had stiffed her. She was going to be furious, and I was counting on her anger to ensure she showed up at the wedding just as the entire operation exploded into public view. I washed my hands in the gold-plated sink, letting the cold water run over my wrists to cool my racing pulse. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was no longer a victim. She was an architect of absolute ruin. The Montgomery family had spent generations building a towering fortress of lies, and I was going to be the one to tear it down, brick by brick. I dried my hands on a monogrammed towel and took a final glance at my phone. The banking alerts were completely silent. The corporate accounts were frozen tight. The financial trap was fully locked in place. I leaned against the marble counter in the lounge, taking a deep, calming breath. The net was pulled completely tight. Brendan and Sylvia had zero access to credit, zero access to cash, and zero access to my stolen funds. Their estate was in active foreclosure. The federal tax agents were moving in, and criminal arrest warrants were actively being drafted by Jamal's contact at the Federal Financial Crimes Division. They were walking corpses in designer clothing, and they had absolutely no idea. I put my phone back into my clutch, checked my lipstick, and practiced my warm bridal smile one more time. It looked entirely flawless. I pushed open the lounge doors and walked back into the elegant dining room. Brendan was sitting at the table, looking pale and thoroughly exhausted. He looked up as I approached, forcing a weak, pathetic smile. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice completely hollow. "Everything is absolutely perfect," I replied cheerfully, taking my seat next to him and resting my hand gently over his. "I have never felt more secure about our future together. Let us enjoy the rest of the evening, Brendan. Tomorrow is going to change our lives in ways you cannot even begin to imagine." The rest of the rehearsal dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. I sat there eating my dry salmon, watching Brendan and Sylvia silently unravel. Every time a waiter approached our table, Brendan flinched, terrified that Mr. Vance had returned to humiliate them further. Sylvia drank 4 more glasses of wine, her eyes darting nervously around the room, clearly calculating how she was going to secure a $60,000 certified check by morning to retrieve her pawned diamonds. They were suffocating in their own lies, and I was holding the only oxygen tank. I watched them squirm, knowing that this small moment of panic was just a tiny preview of the absolute devastation waiting for them tomorrow afternoon. By 9 o'clock, I stood up and gently tapped my champagne glass with a silver spoon. The room quieted down immediately. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I said, projecting my voice with a warm, melodic tone. "I am so incredibly blessed to be joining the Montgomery family tomorrow. Brendan is everything I ever dreamed of. I am going to head home now to get my beauty sleep, but please stay and enjoy the rest of the evening." Brendan stood up quickly, eager to escape the suffocating country club. "I will come with you, Clara." "Oh no, sweetheart," I replied, placing a firm hand on his chest. "It is bad luck to see the bride the night before the wedding. You should go stay at the Plaza Hotel tonight with your groomsmen. It is an old family tradition. Plus, I really need the penthouse entirely to myself to relax and prepare with my bridesmaids early tomorrow morning." He hesitated, clearly desperate to get back to his computer to figure out why his automated theft script had suddenly failed. But with 30 high society guests watching his every move, he had absolutely no choice but to play along. Of course, my love, he smiled weakly, kissing my cheek. I will see you at the altar. I walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club and handed my ticket to the valet. I did not drive back to the penthouse. I drove straight back to my downtown auditing firm. The streets were dark and completely empty. I unlocked the heavy glass doors, bypassed the security system, and walked into my private office. I needed to finalize the master presentation. I had all the raw data, but I needed to transfer the executable files onto an independent encrypted flash drive that I could physically hand to the audiovisual team at the wedding venue tomorrow morning. I booted up my workstation. The glow of the dual monitors illuminated the dark room. I reviewed the digital traps I had set earlier. The corporate accounts were locked tight. The shell company was frozen. Tara's payoff was officially voided. I was just about to export the final slides when a heavy knock echoed against the frosted glass of my office door. I jumped, my heart pounding loudly in my chest. It was nearly midnight. The office building was supposed to be completely empty. I quickly minimized my screens and stood up from my desk. "Who is there?" I called out, my voice sharp and very defensive. "It is me, Clara. Open up." I recognized the deep, calm voice instantly. I unlocked the door and Jamal walked in. He had traded his tailored suit jacket for a dark winter coat, and he looked incredibly exhausted. He closed the door behind him and locked it securely. "Jamal, what are you doing here?" I asked, stepping back to my desk. "I thought you were stuck at the club with Sylvia and Brendan." "I slipped out through the kitchen right after you left," Jamal said, pulling up a leather guest chair and sitting down heavily. The dinner turned into a total nightmare. Sylvia started screaming at the valet because he brought her car around too slowly. Brendan is pacing a hole in the hotel lobby floor, screaming into his cell phone. They are completely panicking right now. Your little credit card stunt totally broke them. "It was not a stunt," I replied coldly, opening my laptop again. "It was a targeted stress test. I needed to see exactly how they react when their fake wealth is challenged in public. Tomorrow is going to be 10 times worse." Jamal reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out a solid military-grade flash drive. He placed it squarely on the center of my desk. "I know, that is exactly why I am here." I stared at the black drive resting on my desk. "What is this, Jamal?" "I already have all the financial data compiled for tomorrow." "This is the ultimate kill shot," Jamal said, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute seriousness. "My contact at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network called me an hour ago. When you froze the shell company tonight, it triggered an automated alert on the federal monitoring wire he set up earlier." Brendan panicked. He tried to log into the Cayman Islands offshore account directly from his mobile phone while standing in the country club lobby. He bypassed the virtual private network entirely. My eyes widened in shock. He logged in from his direct internet protocol address. "Exactly." Jamal nodded, a grim smile spreading across his face. He was entirely careless. He panicked about Tara losing her payment, and he wanted to see if the offshore funds were still there. By doing that, he permanently linked his physical device to the laundered money. The federal agents captured the entire session live. This drive contains the finalized federal indictment drafts, the digital warrants, and the raw communication logs between Brendan and the offshore bankers. It is the absolute undeniable proof of wire fraud. I picked up the heavy drive, feeling the massive weight of Brendan's destruction in the palm of my hand. "This is incredible, Jamal. This legally guarantees the arrest." "It does," Jamal agreed softly. "But it also changes the timeline. The federal agents are not waiting until the reception. They are executing the warrants at the altar. They will be waiting in the hotel lobby before the ceremony even begins. They are going to let you walk down the aisle, but the moment the priest asks for objections, they are moving in. If you want to drop your presentation on the big screens, you have to do it exactly as the wedding music stops playing." I plugged his drive into my secure port and watched the classified federal documents load onto my screen. I integrated the federal warrants directly into the final slide of my presentation. It was absolutely perfect. I dragged the entire master folder onto my secure presentation drive and pulled it out. "It is done," I said, looking up at him. "Thank you, Jamal, for absolutely everything." "Do not thank me quite yet," Jamal warned, standing up and buttoning his heavy coat. "Tomorrow is going to be wildly chaotic. Sylvia is going to scream. Brendan is going to lie to everyone. They will try to turn the entire room against you. You have to be completely composed. You cannot show a single ounce of fear or regret. I stood up, walking around the desk to face him. The girl who would have cried over Brendan died in Sylvia's hallway yesterday morning. I am not a heartbroken bride anymore. I am a forensic auditor closing out a bankrupt account. Jamal gave a slow, respectful nod. Good. I will see you at the venue, Clara. Give them absolute hell. I watched him walk out of my office, leaving me alone in the dark. I packed my briefcase, turned off the monitors, and prepared for war. I walked out of my firm, the heavy locks clicking shut behind me. The underground parking garage was intensely cold, echoing with the sharp sound of my heels against the concrete. As I approached my vehicle, a tall shadow detached itself from a structural pillar nearby. I froze, reaching instinctively into my purse, but the figure stepped into the dim light. It was Jamal. He had not left the building. He was leaning against the hood of my car, staring down with a heavy expression. I relaxed my grip and walked over. I thought you were heading home, I said softly, unlocking the doors. Jamal shook his head slowly, refusing to meet my eyes right away. I am, he replied, his voice rough. But I needed to make sure you truly understand the monster we are taking down tomorrow. You saw the forged loan documents earlier, but you do not know the actual story of what they did to Rebecca. You need to know exactly why I am risking my marriage to help you burn their empire down. I leaned against the cold metal of the car next to him. Tell me, I said simply. Jamal took a deep breath, staring out into the empty garage. It started 2 years ago, right around the time Brendan brought you home to meet the family, Jamal began. Sylvia had just received the first tax lien notice from the government. She called Rebecca over to the main estate in the middle of the night, crying hysterically. Sylvia told my wife that they were going to lose the family home, the house where her late father died. She weaponized Rebecca's grief. Sylvia handed her a stack of commercial loan applications and begged her to co-sign them, promising it was just a temporary formality. Rebecca hesitated because we were aggressively saving our money to buy our first home. We wanted to start a family, but Sylvia always pushes. She told Rebecca that if she did not sign immediately, she would be completely disowned and cut out of the family legacy. My chest tightened as I listened to the raw pain in his voice. It was the exact same manipulative tactic Sylvia used on everyone exploiting love for financial gain. Rebecca signed the first 2 documents. Jamal continued, his jaw clenching with anger. But when Sylvia demanded a third signature a month later, Rebecca finally refused. She told her mother we could not take on any more dangerous debt. Do you know what Sylvia did? She smiled, kissed her daughter on the cheek, and told her not to worry. Then Sylvia and Brendan stole Rebecca's identity. They used her social security number, forged her signature perfectly, and opened 5 massive credit lines in her name. They completely maxed out every single account within 48 hours. They withdrew the cash and funneled it right into their offshore shell companies to hide it from the federal tax agents. We did not find out until 6 months later, when our mortgage application was brutally denied by the bank. Jamal turned to look at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute rage. I sat in a bank manager's office and watched my wife break down in hysterical tears as she realized her own mother and brother had ruined her financial future. Her credit score was annihilated. The collection agencies called our house every single day for an entire year. It almost destroyed our marriage, Clara. Rebecca was so utterly traumatized and brainwashed that she refused to report them to the police. She kept saying we had to protect the prestigious Montgomery name. She took the blame entirely on herself. I had to watch the woman I love suffer in complete silence while Sylvia and Brendan paraded around the country club drinking expensive champagne. A cold, dangerous silence settled between us in the damp garage. The alliance between me and Jamal was no longer just about exposing a bad fiancé. It was fundamentally about raw, undeniable justice. We were 2 outsiders who had been entirely targeted, used, and discarded by a family of narcissistic parasites. They picked the wrong victims, Jamal. I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. They thought because you were quiet and I was eager to please, we were both incredibly weak. They mistook our kindness for stupidity. Tomorrow, we are going to correct that massive misconception in front of every single person they respect. Jamal nodded slowly, a dark smile finally breaking through his heavy expression. That is exactly why I stayed behind in this garage, Clara. I needed to cement this alliance. I needed to look you in the eyes and make sure you are not going to back down at the last second. Brendan is going to beg you. He is going to cry at that altar and use every manipulative trick he has ever learned to make you stop the presentation. Sylvia is going to scream and play the ultimate victim. You cannot let them breathe. You have to execute the trap flawlessly. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the encrypted presentation drive, holding it up in the dim light. I am not backing down, Jamal. Brendan signed his own death warrant the moment he decided to steal my grandmother's money to pay off his mistress. I'm going to stand at that altar, look him dead in the eyes, and watch his entire world collapse into dust. When the federal agents move in, I want you to take Rebecca by the hand and lead her out of the hotel. Shield her from the immediate fallout. Let me handle the absolute destruction of Sylvia and Brendan. Jamal reached out and firmly shook my hand. We have a solid deal, Clara. Get some sleep tonight. You are going to need all your energy for the main event tomorrow. It is going to be a bloodbath, but it will be a beautiful one. I promised myself I would see this through until the bitter end, no matter what happens to their family name. He turned around and walked away, his footsteps echoing loudly through the massive concrete garage as he headed toward the exit sign, glowing faintly in the distance. I watched him leave, feeling a massive surge of pure adrenaline rushing rapidly through my veins. The final piece of the puzzle was locked perfectly into place. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and drove out into the dark city streets. The clock was officially ticking down to the absolute most destructive wedding day in history. Instead of heading home, I drove directly across town to a secure meeting location. My attorney, a ruthless corporate litigator named Evelyn, agreed to open her downtown office at 1 in the morning. When I stepped off the elevator, Evelyn was waiting patiently. Next to her was Agent Carter, the senior investigator from the Federal Enforcement Network Jamal contacted earlier. The counterstrike was officially moving from a personal vendetta to a coordinated federal sting operation. Evelyn led us into her soundproof conference room. The oak table was covered with printouts of the financial data I securely transmitted earlier. I placed Jamal's encrypted flash drive directly in the center of the table. This is the final piece, I told them, sliding the heavy drive toward Carter. Brendan logged into the offshore Cayman account directly from a domestic internet protocol address 3 hours ago. The entire session is captured on that drive, linking him directly to the laundered funds. Agent Carter picked up the drive, his expression unreadable. If what Jamal told me is accurate and this drive contains direct server logs of wire fraud, we have enough evidence to secure a federal indictment by sunrise. But I need to be absolutely clear about the operational parameters, Clara. We do not usually execute arrest warrants in the middle of a high society wedding ceremony. My commanding officer is taking a massive institutional risk by authorizing this deployment. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. You are taking down a multi-million-dollar tax evasion ring. Sylvia has been hiding immense wealth from the government for 3 years. Brendan is actively stealing business funds across state lines. If you arrest them quietly at home, Sylvia will instantly leverage her political connections to secure bail. She will hire aggressive crisis managers to spin the narrative. They will spend years hiding assets in legal loopholes. You must catch them off guard where they have zero control over optics. Evelyn nodded, tapping a silver pen against the table. She is completely right, Carter. You want a watertight criminal conviction. When Clara projects the financial evidence onto the massive screens in front of 300 elite guests, the Montgomery family will completely panic. They will try to explain it away, and in their desperation, they will make public recorded admissions of guilt. It is the perfect psychological pressure cooker for a financial confession. Carter plugged the encrypted flash drive into his secured federal terminal. He reviewed the network logs in heavy silence for 10 minutes. I watched the glowing light of the screen reflect in his dark eyes as he traced the undeniable digital footprint of Brendan's staggering greed. Finally, Carter stopped and looked up at me. The warrants will be signed by a federal judge at 8 o'clock this morning. I will have a team of 6 undercover agents positioned inside the hotel ballroom. We will be dressed seamlessly as venue staff and private security. I need your absolute assurance regarding the timing, I said firmly. You cannot move in the second the wedding music stops. I need to deliver my entire presentation to the audience. I need Sylvia and Brendan to see their entire fraudulent empire collapse in real time. When I drop the final slide showing the offshore routing numbers, that is your exact cue to step forward and execute the arrests. Carter crossed his arms, leaning back heavily. We will wait for your exact visual signal, Clara. But the precise moment we announce our federal authority, you must step back. Do not engage with them once the handcuffs come out. Desperate people do incredibly stupid things when cornered. I agreed to his terms. With the criminal aspect locked in place, I turned to Evelyn to finalize my financial defense. The agents were handling the prison sentences, but Evelyn was securing my trust. Have the bank freezes been processed? I asked. Evelyn handed me a stack of legally binding documents. Everything is isolated and fortified, she confirmed with a sharp smile. Your grandmother's trust is severed from the marital accounts. I also drafted a preemptive civil lawsuit against Sylvia and Brendan for corporate embezzlement. The moment Carter places them under arrest, a process server will hand them the civil litigation papers. They will face federal prison and a massive corporate lawsuit simultaneously. They will not have a single dime to pay their defense attorneys. I signed the final pages of the civil lawsuit, pressing the pen into the paper with absolute conviction. The financial trap was entirely flawless. Brendan wanted to use my hard-earned money to save his bankrupt mother and pay off his secret mistress. Instead, he was walking straight into a meticulously designed federal ambush that would permanently strip him of his freedom, his reputation, and his fake wealth. It was nearly 3 in the morning by the time we finished reviewing the tactical layout of the Plaza Hotel ballroom. Agent Carter mapped out the exact entry points his team would use to block all the emergency exits. Evelyn confirmed that the hotel management was entirely unaware of the impending raid, ensuring nobody could tip off the Montgomery family. We shook hands, sealing the absolute most destructive legal alliance in modern wedding history. I left the law firm and drove my car slowly back home. The entire city was completely silent, the glowing amber streetlights reflecting off the damp winter pavement. When I quietly unlocked the heavy front door, the massive apartment was dark and completely still. Brendan was at a luxury hotel with his groomsmen, sleeping soundly under the grand delusion that he had successfully outsmarted me. I walked into the master bedroom, took off my heavy winter coat, and sat on the edge of the large bed. I did not feel tired. The raw adrenaline pumping through my system was entirely electric. I had spent my entire professional career hunting financial criminals for other corporate entities. Tomorrow I was finally doing it to entirely protect myself. I remembered walking into the private dining room of the Oak Ridge Country Club just after 7 o'clock. I was actively playing the role of the perfectly oblivious, incredibly grateful bride. I wore a simple, elegant white silk dress that I bought off the rack. Brendan greeted me at the entrance with a perfectly practiced smile, handing me a glass of expensive vintage champagne that he was secretly paying for with my stolen corporate funds. He kissed my cheek, completely unaware that I had already spent the entire afternoon dismantling his financial life block by block. Sylvia was holding court at the center table, surrounded by her wealthy socialite friends. She wore a heavy emerald necklace that I knew from my deep dive audit was currently being used as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. When she saw me approach, her fake, intensely tight smile appeared. Clara, my dear, Sylvia had purred loudly, making sure the surrounding tables could hear her. She looked me up and down with obvious disdain. That dress is very practical. It is so refreshing how you never feel the need to dress up to our usual family standards. I suppose coming from a working-class background makes you appreciate the much simpler things in life. In the past, a public comment like that would have made me flush with intense embarrassment. I would have felt small and completely unworthy of the prestigious Montgomery name. But sitting there last night, knowing the federal arrest warrants were already being drafted by Agent Carter, her condescending tone was absolutely hilarious. I simply smiled my warmest, most naive smile. "Thank you, Sylvia," I replied sweetly, taking my seat next to Brendan. I am just so incredibly lucky to be marrying into such a successful and established family. I have so much to learn from your financial wisdom. Sylvia beamed with pure arrogance, completely missing the absolute sarcasm laced tightly into my words. She turned back to her wealthy friends, loudly complaining about the rising costs of maintaining their summer estate in the Hamptons. It was an estate that had already been quietly repossessed by the commercial bank exactly 3 months ago. I sat there sipping my champagne, mentally mapping out every single fraudulent loan the guests at our table were currently wrapped up in. It was a table of total financial ghosts pretending to be royalty. When it was time for the formal toasts, Sylvia stood up and tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room of 30 elite guests fell entirely silent. She looked down at me from her authoritative position at the head of the table. To my only son, Brendan, Sylvia began, her voice dripping with fake theatrical emotion. You are the heir to a massive legacy. The Montgomery name stands for generational wealth, absolute integrity, and high society influence. And to Clara, we are so very generous to welcome you into our exclusive world. It takes a very special, very patient family to teach someone from the outside how to properly manage real wealth and societal expectations. She looked around the room, making direct eye contact with her highly judgmental peers. Clara is a hard worker. Sylvia continued, her tone dripping with intense, sugary condescension. She runs a little accounting business. It is very cute. But tomorrow she becomes a Montgomery. She will finally understand what it means to be part of an untouchable historic dynasty. Let us raise our glasses to Clara for finally stepping up in the world, and to Brendan for his incredible charity in choosing her. The guests raised their glasses, clapping politely. Brendan squeezed my hand under the table, leaning in to whisper directly into my ear. Do not let her get to you, Clara. She just has very high standards. You know I love you no matter where you come from. I had looked at him, studying his handsome, completely deceitful face. While his mother was publicly humiliating me, he was actively using his cell phone under the linen tablecloth to check on the automated wire transfer he scheduled to pay his pregnant mistress. He was stealing my money while telling me he loved me. I had squeezed his hand back, flashing him a look of pure, unbroken adoration. I know, Brendan, I whispered back. I promise you by tomorrow afternoon, your mother is going to understand exactly what kind of accountant I really am. That interaction happened right before the waiter brought the massive bill. That was right before I triggered the financial trap and walked away. Sitting in my dark bedroom now, watching the first faint light of dawn creep through the sheer curtains, the memory of Sylvia's arrogant speech solidified my cold determination. They truly believed I was just a naive new money bank account they could blindly drain and discard. They believed their fake generational wealth made them entirely immune to any real-world consequences. I stood up from the edge of the large bed and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. The city skyline was beginning to glow with the early morning light. Today was the day. In exactly 8 hours, I was going to put on a custom designer wedding gown. I was going to hold a heavy bouquet of imported white roses. I was going to walk down a beautiful aisle surrounded by hundreds of high society guests, federal undercover agents, and a completely oblivious groom. I walked into the master bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the freezing cold water hit the marble tiles. I needed to be absolutely sharp. There was no room for hesitation, no room for empathy, and absolutely no room for mercy. Sylvia wanted to teach me a lesson about high society. Brendan wanted to use my intelligence to fund his toxic double life. Today, they were both going to get a brutal masterclass in forensic auditing. I stepped into the cold water, washing away the final traces of the naive girl who had fallen in love with Brendan Montgomery. She was completely gone. I stepped out, wrapped a thick towel around my shoulders, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were completely cold. The perfect, oblivious bride was ready to go to work. I picked up my phone from the counter and sent a single encrypted text message to Agent Carter. The message was incredibly simple. The bride is awake, I typed out quickly. Prepare the federal warrants. I hit send and immediately deleted the secure message thread from my phone. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy penthouse doors burst open. A small army of hairstylists, makeup artists, and wedding photographers flooded into my private suite. The quiet, cold isolation of my early morning was instantly replaced by the overwhelming, frantic chaos of a high society wedding day. My three bridesmaids, all close friends, who were completely unaware of the impending federal raid, rushed in, carrying mimosas and silver garment bags. They squealed with delight, pulling me into a massive group hug. "Clara, you look so incredibly relaxed, my maid of honor," Sarah gushed as she handed me a crystal flute of orange juice and expensive champagne. I was so intensely nervous on my wedding morning I threw up twice. "You look like you are about to close a massive corporate merger." I laughed softly, taking a small sip of the cold drink. "In a way, I am Sarah. Today is all about finalizing the absolute most important contract of my entire life." For the next 3 hours, I played the role of the radiant, deeply in love bride to absolute perfection. I sat in the plush velvet makeup chair, allowing the stylist to pin up my hair and apply airbrushed foundation. The lead photographer, a highly sought-after professional that Sylvia had aggressively insisted upon hiring to maintain their wealthy image, circled me constantly. He barked out constant directions, telling me to tilt my chin lower, my eyes, and smile softly at the natural light pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I followed every single instruction flawlessly. I looked completely serene, the very picture of a lucky woman about to step into a fairy tale life of generational wealth and untouchable privilege. But underneath the white silk, getting ready robe, my mind was running a highly complex series of financial algorithms. I needed a window of exactly 5 minutes of uninterrupted screen time to execute the final fatal blow to Brendan's personal liquidity. "Okay, ladies," the photographer announced, clapping his hands loudly to get our attention. "I need to go down to the hotel lobby to get some wide architectural shots of the venue before the guests start arriving. I will be back in exactly 10 minutes to capture Clara stepping into the wedding gown. Everyone take a quick break." The bridesmaids immediately scattered to the adjoining suite to touch up their own lipstick and take group photos. The makeup artist packed up her brushes and stepped out into the hallway to take a personal phone call. I was finally completely alone in the master bedroom. I walked over to the velvet chaise lounge where my designer purse was resting. I pulled out my phone and sat down, making sure my back was angled sharply away from the open doorway. My heart rate ticked up slightly, a steady drumbeat of pure adrenaline. I opened my encrypted banking application and bypassed the biometric security check. I navigated directly to the massive joint account I shared with Brendan. When we first got engaged, Brendan had practically demanded we combine our liquid assets to streamline our eventual mortgage applications for a sprawling estate he claimed we were buying in the Hamptons. He had cited his family's traditional approach to marital wealth, insisting that pooling our money proved our absolute trust in one another. I had transferred exactly $400,000 of my own hard-earned money into this specific account, money I had saved meticulously from my auditing firm's profits. Brendan claimed he had deposited an equal amount from his family trust, but my deep dive audit had revealed the horrific truth. His supposed contribution was entirely composed of highly leveraged margin loans and fraudulent credit advances. The actual physical cash in the account was entirely mine. And because my name was explicitly listed as a primary account holder, I had the absolute legal right to withdraw every single penny without his immediate authorization. I stared at the total available balance glowing on the screen. $400,200. I tapped the transfer button. Evelyn, my ruthless corporate litigator, had finalized the legal routing numbers for my grandmother's heavily fortified, untouchable trust account earlier that morning. I entered the routing information carefully, double-checking every single digit to ensure there were no errors. The banking system prompted me for the exact transfer amount. I did not want to close the account completely. A sudden total account closure would immediately trigger an automatic email alert to Brendan's mobile phone, and I needed him completely blind and supremely confident until the moment he stood at the altar. I typed in the transfer amount, $400,000 exactly. I purposely left $200 behind. It was the exact amount of pathetic crumpled cash Brendan had managed to pull from his silver money clip at the country club last night when his mother's fraudulent empire first began to crack under pressure. It felt like incredibly fitting, deeply satisfying poetic justice. He could use that $200 to buy himself a decent meal at the Federal Holding Facility commissary next week. A small warning box popped up on my screen, advising me that electronic transfers over $100,000 required a secondary security verification. I quickly typed in my personal identification number and answered the two security questions. What was the name of your first pet? What city did your mother grow up in? My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard with absolute precision. Just as I pressed the final confirm button, the bedroom door creaked open behind me. Clara, are you almost ready? Sarah asked, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. We need to get you into the dress right now before the photographer gets back upstairs. I did not flinch. I did not scramble to hide the phone like a guilty criminal. I simply locked the screen smoothly and turned around with a bright, effortless smile. I was just sending a quick text message to Brendan. I lied effortlessly, slipping the phone back into my purse. I wanted to tell him how much I fiercely love him before we have to give our phones to the wedding coordinator for the ceremony. That is so incredibly sweet, Sarah sighed, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. He is such a lucky guy. You two are literally the perfect modern couple. I stood up, smoothing down the front of my silk robe. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive physical weight had been completely lifted from my shoulders. The massive transfer was officially processed. The money was securely locked inside my grandmother's impenetrable trust. The joint account was entirely drained. Brendan Montgomery, the arrogant heir to a fake empire, officially had a net worth of exactly $200. He had zero credit, zero access to stolen funds, and absolutely zero escape routes. Let us get this dress on, I said, my voice ringing with absolute confidence. I do not want to keep my groom waiting a single second longer than necessary. Sarah unzipped the heavy canvas garment bag, revealing the custom designer wedding gown. It was a masterpiece of intricate lace and heavy silk, a dress fit for high society royalty. I stepped into it, letting the expensive fabric settle around my waist as the bridesmaids rushed to fasten the dozens of tiny pearl buttons up my spine. The photographer walked back into the room just as Sarah attached the long, sweeping veil to my hair. The cameras immediately started flashing, capturing the stunning, victorious look shining brightly in my eyes. The trap was fully set, the accounts were completely empty, and the countdown to absolute destruction had officially begun. The cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the heavy lace and intricate beadwork of my custom silk gown. The photographer circled me constantly, loudly praising my radiant expression, completely oblivious to the cold, calculated reason behind my glowing smile. After 20 minutes of exhausting poses and minor adjustments, I raised my hand gently. I need just a few minutes alone, I announced to the bustling room. A bride needs a quiet moment to catch her breath before the absolute chaos begins. Sarah quickly ushered the photographer and the makeup team out of the master suite, promising they would wait for me down in the main lobby with the stretched limousines. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me in absolute silence once again. I walked over to the digital security panel mounted on the wall near the apartment entrance. It was time to execute the physical lockout. As I typed my master administrative code into the glowing touchscreen, I felt a deep wave of immense satisfaction, remembering exactly how flawlessly I had executed the first phase of this physical lockout the night before. I had returned to the penthouse from my late-night strategy meeting with Jamal and the federal investigators to find Brendan pacing the expensive hardwood floors of our living room like a trapped animal. He was sweating heavily through his designer shirt, frantically trying to reach his offshore bankers on his cell phone. He was completely panicked because his automated theft script had failed and the shell accounts were completely frozen. When I walked through the front door, he had immediately masked his sheer terror with a charming, exhausted smile. He tried to pull me into a warm hug, whispering about how stressed the rehearsal dinner had made him and how much he needed to use my secure desktop computer to check some urgent work emails. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He desperately wanted to bypass the financial blocks I had placed on his software. But I did not yield a single inch. I had stepped back, holding up my hands with a playful, superstitious gasp. "You absolutely cannot be here," I had told him, feigning complete shock. It is the night before the wedding, Brendan. It is incredibly bad luck for us to sleep under the same roof. I had already packed his expensive leather overnight bag, leaving it sitting neatly by the front door. Brendan argued, running a shaky hand through his hair. He claimed he just wanted to hold me, but the sheer desperation in his eyes betrayed his sweet lies. I gently pushed his heavy designer bag into his chest and kissed his cheek. "Go to the Plaza Hotel," I insisted with a bright, unwavering smile. "Drink expensive scotch with your groomsmen. I will see you at the altar." Defeated and entirely out of options, he had dragged his luggage to the private elevator, glancing back at my locked office door with pure, unadulterated agony. The second the elevator doors had closed on his miserable face last night, I went to work. Now, standing in my heavy wedding dress, I was simply finalizing the ultimate trap. I opened the smart home application on my phone and navigated directly to the building management portal. I permanently revoked Brendan's biometric access to the private elevator. I deleted his digital keycard from the penthouse lobby system. I even contacted the luxury building's head of security, a retired police officer named Marcus. I explicitly informed Marcus that my fiancé and his family were absolutely no longer permitted on the premises. I authorized Marcus to use whatever physical force necessary to remove them if they attempted to bypass the front desk. If Brendan tried to come back here after the federal agents humiliated him at the altar, he would be stopped at the sidewalk by heavy security. I moved through the massive apartment, double-checking every single physical entry point. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolts on the terrace doors overlooking the city skyline. I changed the digital combination to the master wall safe, locking away all of my important legal documents, passports, and the raw physical copies of the wire fraud evidence. I logged into the central router and completely wiped all of his devices from the home network. I activated the motion sensors in the main living areas, setting the silent alarm to immediately dispatch private security and local police if the perimeter was breached in any way. This penthouse was legally in my name alone. I had purchased it entirely with my own corporate auditing profits, long before Brendan and his toxic family slithered into my life. He had spent the last 2 years treating it like his own personal kingdom, throwing lavish parties for his arrogant friends, smoking expensive cigars on the balcony, and drinking my vintage wine. That era of extreme exploitation was permanently over. The castle was officially sealed tight. I walked back into the master bedroom and picked up my heavy bouquet of imported white roses. The stems were wrapped in a delicate silk ribbon that perfectly matched my gown. I looked at the massive king-sized bed where Brendan had lied to me every single night. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical precision. The financial accounts were drained to exactly $200. The federal agents were currently moving into tactical positions around the hotel ballroom. The presentation drive was fully loaded with undeniable proof of wire fraud, and now his physical sanctuary was completely locked down. He was a man without a bank account, without a home, and in just a few short hours, without his freedom. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror one last time. The bride looking back at me was an absolute weapon. I turned off the master bedroom lights, letting the sprawling penthouse fall into complete shadows. I walked out into the private foyer and pressed the glowing button for the elevator. The digital security panel beeped twice, confirming the system was fully armed and locked. I stepped into the elevator car, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the numbers ticked down rapidly, my pulse remained incredibly steady. I was not walking toward a wedding ceremony. I was walking toward an execution. The heavy metal doors opened to the bustling lobby, where Sarah and the rest of my bridal party erupted into loud cheers. The black limousines were idling at the curb to take us to the venue. I took a deep breath, pasted on my perfect oblivious smile, and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. The ride to the Plaza Hotel was a blur of expensive champagne and loud pop music. My bridesmaids laughed and sang in the back of the stretched limousine, completely ignorant of the massive federal sting operation waiting at our final destination. I sat by the tinted window watching the busy city blocks roll by my hands, resting calmly on the heavy layers of my white silk gown. When the limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the luxury hotel, the sheer scale of the event finally hit me. Sylvia had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the stolen funds and forged credit lines to rent the most exclusive ballroom in the entire city. Massive floral arches framed the gold revolving doors, and a dedicated team of valets rushed forward to open our doors. I stepped out onto the red carpet, instantly swarmed by venue coordinators with headsets and clipboards. We were escorted quickly through the breathtaking main lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors. As we made our way toward the private bridal suite on the mezzanine level, my eyes scanned the perimeter with the trained, calculating precision of a corporate forensic auditor. I spotted them almost immediately. A man in a sharp black suit posing as private security near the main emergency exit. A woman adjusting floral arrangements near the coat check, a clear earpiece completely visible beneath her hair. Agent Carter had kept his word. The federal undercover team was fully integrated into the venue staff, quietly sealing off every single escape route. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline. The physical trap was officially locked in place. As we approached the grand staircase, I heard her before I saw her. Sylvia was standing in the center of the grand foyer, wearing an aggressively flashy silver gown that looked more suited for a red carpet premiere than a morning wedding. She was furiously barking orders at the catering manager, completely losing her temper over the precise placement of the caviar stations. She looked incredibly exhausted, her heavy makeup failing to hide the deep stress lines caused by last night's financial terror. When she saw me, her fake, tightly pulled smile snapped instantly onto her face. "Clara," she called out, waving her heavily manicured hand. "You are slightly behind schedule. The photographers need you in the bridal suite for the getting ready shots immediately. Brendan is already in his suite looking absolutely handsome." I smiled back, radiating absolute flawless bridal joy. "I will hurry, Sylvia, I promise sweetly. I just need a quick moment to check on a very special surprise I planned for the reception." I did not wait for her condescending reply. I grabbed my heavy silk skirt and hurried up the stairs, leaving Sarah and the bridesmaids to handle Sylvia. But I did not go to the bridal suite. I took a sharp turn down a carpeted service hallway, navigating the labyrinth of back corridors until I reached the massive double doors of the main ballroom. The room was breathtaking, set for 300 elite guests, with towering white floral centerpieces and gold-plated tableware. At the far end of the room stood the massive high-definition screens I had explicitly demanded for a supposed photo montage of our relationship. Tucked behind a heavy black curtain next to the main stage was the audiovisual control booth. I slipped behind the curtain and found the head technician, a young guy named Mark, frantically adjusting audio sliders on a massive digital soundboard. "Mark," Y said softly, stepping into the small, cramped space. He jumped, completely surprised to see the bride fully dressed in her gown, invading his technical sanctuary. "Miss Clara," he stammered, pulling off his heavy headphones. "You should not be back here. Your expensive dress is going to get dusty." I reached into the deep pocket I had specifically instructed my seamstress to sew into the heavy silk layers of my wedding gown. I pulled out the solid black military-grade flash drive Jamal had given me the night before. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Mark," I said, dropping the cheerful bride persona entirely and adopting the cold, commanding tone of a senior corporate executive. "This drive contains the actual presentation for the reception. It completely replaces the photo montage we discussed last week." Mark looked confused, reaching out to take the drive. "Okay, I can load it into the queue right now." I held the drive tightly, refusing to release it just yet. "No, you do not just load it," I instructed, firmly locking my eyes directly onto his. "This is a highly sensitive corporate presentation regarding a massive surprise for my new husband and his family. I want this drive plugged directly into the primary secure terminal. You do not open the files. You do not preview the slides. You keep the screens completely black until the exact moment I give you the visual signal." "What is the signal?" Mark asked, his eyes widening slightly at my intense demeanor. "When the priest asks if anyone objects to this union, I will turn and look directly at this booth." I explained, articulating every single word with absolute precision. "I will nod my head exactly one time. When I nod, you hit play on the master file. You push the audio through the main ballroom speakers at maximum volume. Under absolutely no circumstances do you stop the presentation until it reaches the final slide. Even if Sylvia screams. Even if Brendan demands you cut the power, you only listen to me, do you understand? To guarantee his absolute loyalty. I reached into my other hidden pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope containing $2,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I placed it securely on the soundboard next to his keyboard. This is a personal tip for ensuring flawless execution, I said smoothly. Mark looked down at the massive stack of cash, then back up at my cold, unwavering expression. He swallowed hard and nodded quickly. I understand completely, Miss Clara. Nobody touches the board but me. I handed him the black flash drive. He immediately plugged it into the secure port and routed it to the massive screens. I watched the green confirmation light blink on the terminal, verifying the highly encrypted federal files were fully loaded and ready to deploy. The digital guillotine was now officially armed. I thanked Mark, slipped back out from behind the heavy black curtain, and walked quickly toward the bridal suite. The venue was secured. The federal agents were positioned in the shadows. The devastating evidence was loaded into the system. The only thing left to do was walk down that long white aisle and watch the entire Montgomery empire burn to the ground. I hurried down the carpeted hallway and finally pushed open the heavy oak doors of the private bridal suite. Sarah and the rest of the bridesmaids were already inside, sipping fresh mimosas and adjusting their matching emerald green gowns. The room smelled intensely of expensive hairspray and imported white lilies. I had barely taken 2 steps into the elegant room when the heavy wooden doors swung open behind me with a violent, aggressive thud. Sylvia marched into the suite. She had completely dropped the fake sugary wedding planner persona she was wearing in the main lobby just 10 minutes earlier. Her eyes were bloodshot and her jaw was locked in a tight, furious line. She gripped a thick manila folder in her right hand so hard her knuckles were turning completely white. Everyone except Clara needs to leave this room immediately, Sylvia barked, not even bothering to look at my friends. This is a private family matter. Sarah looked at me, clearly offended and very concerned by the sudden intrusion. I gave her a small, reassuring nod. It is completely fine, Sarah, I said softly. Go check on the groomsmen and make sure Brendan is ready. I will be out in just a few minutes. The bridesmaids quickly filed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind them and leaving me entirely alone with the monster. Sylvia did not waste a single second. She marched directly over to the marble vanity table, slapped the manila folder down, and aggressively pulled out a massive stack of dense legal documents. She produced a gold-plated fountain pen from her clutch and slammed it down next to the paper. Sign this right now, Sylvia commanded, crossing her arms tightly over her flashy silver gown. I walked slowly over to the vanity, my heavy silk wedding dress rustling loudly against the plush carpet. I did not reach for the pen. I simply looked down at the top page. It was a prenuptial agreement, but it was not a standard marital contract. As my trained auditor eyes quickly scanned the dense legal jargon, the absolute audacity of her desperation became incredibly clear. She was not trying to protect the Montgomery estate from me. She was actively trying to legally bind my personal assets to their rapidly sinking ship. What is this, Sylvia? I asked, keeping my voice entirely calm and deliberately naive. Brendan and I explicitly discussed this months ago. We decided we did not need a prenuptial agreement because we trust each other completely. That was before I realized how entirely complicated your little grandmother's trust fund was. Sylvia spat back her mask of high society elegance, slipping away to reveal the frantic, cornered criminal underneath. Brendan is the heir to a massive legacy. We simply cannot risk exposing our generational wealth to an outsider without proper legal safeguards. It is just standard corporate procedure. Sign the bottom of the 3rd page and initial the financial disclosures immediately. I leaned in closer to the document. The financial disclosures were completely blank. She wanted me to sign a blank legal contract. Even worse, Clause 4 of the 2nd page contained a predatory marital liability waiver. I recognized the specific legal phrasing immediately. It was the exact same boilerplate language they used to trap Jamal's wife, Rebecca, 2 years ago. They were trying to recycle their financial abuse tactics. If I signed this document, I would be legally accepting joint responsibility for all of Brendan's pre-existing commercial debt. She was trying to make me the primary guarantor for the millions of dollars they had fraudulently borrowed against their repossessed properties. If the federal raid was not happening in exactly 30 minutes, this single piece of paper would have completely destroyed my financial life forever. I am sorry, Sylvia, I said, stepping back from the marble table and folding my hands politely in front of my gown. But I cannot sign a legal document without having my personal attorney review it first. Evelyn would be absolutely furious with me. Sylvia stepped forward, aggressively invading my personal space. Her expensive perfume smelled sour and overwhelmingly heavy. You do not have time to call a cheap corporate lawyer, Clara. The string quartet is already playing in the main ballroom. 300 of the most important people in this city are sitting in those chairs waiting for a wedding. If you do not sign this contract right now, I will personally walk out there, cancel the entire ceremony, and tell everyone you were trying to extort my son for his money. You will be entirely ruined in this town. I looked directly into her frantic, bloodshot eyes. She was bluffing. She was entirely out of cash, her credit lines were frozen, and she desperately needed my grandmother's trust to pay off the massive tax liens before the government seized her remaining assets. She needed this wedding to happen more than she needed oxygen to breathe. I let a long, suffocating silence stretch between us. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I just stood there, perfectly poised in my custom designer gown, watching her slowly realize that her usual intimidation tactics were completely failing. The faint sound of the string quartet echoed through the thick walls, a steady rhythmic ticking of the clock. Sylvia shifted her weight nervously from one expensive heel to the other. She was not used to being ignored. She was used to screaming until people simply surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. But I was entirely unbothered. "You are sweating, Sylvia," I finally said, my voice dropping its naive warmth and taking on a cold, clinical edge. Sylvia flinched instinctively, reaching a hand up to touch her carefully powdered forehead. "What did you just say to me?" she hissed. "I said you are sweating," I repeated, maintaining my dead, unwavering stare. "You are shaking too, and you are demanding I sign a contract that lists Harbor Consulting Limited as a primary marital asset. That is very strange, Sylvia. Because Harbor Consulting is a Delaware shell company, not a family trust. Why would you include an empty shell company in a standard prenuptial agreement?" All the remaining color instantly drained from Sylvia's face. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked at the document, then back up at me, pure panic finally breaking through her aggressive facade. She had absolutely no idea how I knew the specific legal name of their money laundering vehicle. "That is just a subsidiary," Sylvia stammered, taking a small physical step backward. "It is a minor administrative detail. It is a massive federal liability," I corrected her sharply. "I will not sign this document, Sylvia. Not today, not ever. Now I suggest you take this fraudulent paperwork, put it back in your expensive folder, and go take your seat in the front row. Because your son is waiting for me at the altar, and I am going to give him exactly the wedding he truly deserves." Sylvia stared at me, as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying, unrecognizable creature. The sweet, compliant accountant she thought she could easily manipulate was completely gone. She snatched the documents off the vanity, her hands trembling violently. She shoved them back into the manila folder and turned toward the door. She paused with her hand on the brass handle, looking back at me with absolute venom. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, Clara," she whispered darkly. I gave her one final chilling smile. "I think we both know that is no longer true, Sylvia. Now go take your seat. The show is about to begin." She practically ran out of the room, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. I stood alone in the quiet bridal suite, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The fake prenuptial agreement was a desperate, pathetic final move. It proved they knew the walls were rapidly closing in. I checked my reflection in the mirror one last time. My hair was flawless. My makeup was completely perfect, and my pulse was remarkably steady. A gentle knock sounded on the door. It was the venue coordinator holding a clipboard and smiling brightly. "It is time, Miss Clara," she announced cheerfully. "The groom is at the altar and everyone is waiting for you." I picked up my heavy bouquet of imported white roses, the delicate silk ribbon wrapping tightly around my steady hands. "I am completely ready," I replied. "Let us go finish this." I followed the venue coordinator down the long, carpeted corridor. The heavy silk of my dress rustled loudly in the quiet space, a rhythmic sweeping sound that matched the steady beating of my heart. We reached the massive double doors leading into the main ballroom. The coordinator adjusted her headset, giving me a bright, encouraging smile. "They are ready for you," she whispered, stepping back into the shadows. The heavy wooden doors remained closed for just another moment. I stood perfectly still, clutching the bouquet of white roses tightly against my waist. I closed my eyes and took one final, incredibly deep breath. I pushed the remaining traces of human empathy into a tiny locked box in the back of my mind. I was no longer a woman. I was a finely tuned instrument of absolute ruin. The majestic sounds of a live string quartet suddenly swelled through the thick walls. It was the traditional bridal march played with aggressive, expensive perfection. The massive oak doors swung open simultaneously, pulled back by two venue staff members wearing pristine white gloves. A blinding wave of light from the crystal chandeliers hit my face, immediately followed by the rapid, blinding flashes of a dozen professional cameras. I stepped forward into the grand ballroom. The sheer scale of the opulence was physically staggering. Towering arrangements of imported white orchids and hydrangeas framed the long mirrored aisle. The ceiling was draped in thousands of yards of sheer white chiffon, glowing softly under the expensive lighting design. 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city were packed into the golden Chiavari chairs. They all stood up in unison as I entered the room. They turned their heads, their expensive jewelry catching the light, their eyes entirely fixed on me. I kept my chin perfectly level and my gaze entirely steady. I began my slow, measured walk down the mirrored aisle. It was a massive sea of high society predators, and I was walking straight through the middle of them. I recognized dozens of faces from my forensic audit. I saw the aggressive commercial real estate developers who had knowingly approved Sylvia's fraudulent bridge loans. I saw the corrupt regional bank managers who had looked the other way when Brendan actively forged Rebecca's signature. I saw the heavily Botoxed country club wives who had spent the last 2 years loudly whispering about my working-class background behind my back. They were all smiling at me now, clapping softly, completely unaware that the massive financial blast radius was going to hit every single one of them. As I took another step forward, my eyes scanned the perimeter of the room. I spotted the undercover federal agents immediately. They were entirely flawless in their execution. One agent was dressed as a sommelier, standing quietly near the champagne tower, with a white towel draped over his arm. Another was positioned near the emergency exit, wearing a venue security badge and speaking softly into a hidden microphone near his wrist. They were watching me closely, waiting for the visual signal to drop the net. I shifted my gaze to the second row. Jamal was standing there looking incredibly sharp in a tailored black tuxedo. Next to him was his wife, Rebecca. She looked beautiful but intensely nervous, her hands clutching a small silver purse tightly against her chest. She had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Jamal had kept his word, shielding her from the operational details to ensure her reactions were entirely genuine. When Jamal made eye contact with me, he gave a slow, nearly imperceptible nod of absolute solidarity. I turned my attention to the front row. Sylvia was standing exactly where she belonged. She looked entirely like a ghost. Her aggressive silver gown suddenly seemed ridiculously out of place. The confident, domineering matriarch who had tried to force me to sign a fraudulent legal contract just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. She was staring at me with raw, unfiltered terror. Her hands were visibly shaking as she gripped the back of the golden chair in front of her. She knew the walls were rapidly closing in, but she was entirely paralyzed by the public spectacle. She could not scream, she could not run, and she absolutely could not stop me. Finally, I locked my eyes on the altar. Brendan was standing there under a massive arch of cascading white roses. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. His hair was perfectly styled, and he was flashing his signature incredibly handsome smile. But as I got closer, The trained auditor inside me noticed the microscopic fractures in his facade. He was sweating heavily along his hairline. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a small muscle twitched violently near his ear. He was nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. He was actively panicking because his offshore accounts were frozen, but he was desperately trying to play the role of the incredibly wealthy, deeply in love groom for the cameras. I smiled warmly at him. It was a masterpiece of deception. I let my eyes soften, projecting pure, unadulterated adoration as I took the final steps down the mirrored aisle. I watched his shoulders relax slightly as he saw my loving expression. He actually believed he was safe. He actually believed that whatever technical glitch had frozen his stolen money last night was just a temporary setback. He believed he had successfully trapped me. I reached the end of the aisle and stepped up onto the elevated marble platform. The string quartet brought the sweeping music to a graceful, dramatic close. The heavy silence that followed was incredibly thick, broken only by the soft, rustling sounds of 300 guests sitting back down in their golden chairs. Brendan reached out and took my hands in his. His palms were incredibly cold and uncomfortably damp. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Clara," he whispered softly, leaning in close so the microphone clipped to the priest's robe would capture his romantic words. "I have never loved you more than I do right in this exact moment." I squeezed his cold, clammy hands, gently maintaining my flawless bridal smile. "You have absolutely no idea how much this day means to me, Brendan," I whispered back, my voice entirely steady. "Everything is about to change forever." The priest, an older man with a gentle face and a very traditional demeanor, stepped forward and opened his heavy leather binder. He cleared his throat, looking out over the massive crowd of elite guests. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his deep voice echoing loudly through the massive ballroom speakers. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and this incredible company to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. It is a bond built on absolute truth, deep trust, and unshakable financial and emotional partnership." I stood perfectly still, listening to the deeply ironic words echoing through the room. I was not looking at the priest. I was staring directly into Brendan's lying eyes. I could see the massive high-definition screens positioned directly behind the altar, currently completely black, waiting silently for my command. The digital guillotine was hovering directly over his neck. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy flash drive resting securely in the soundboard across the room. The long walk down the aisle was officially over. The execution was about to begin. The priest smiled warmly at both of us, totally unaware of the invisible guillotine hanging over the altar. "Marriage is not simply a legal contract," he continued, his voice resonating smoothly through the grand ballroom. "It is a profound spiritual union. It requires absolute transparency, unwavering loyalty, and a commitment to protect one another from the storms of life." I watched Brendan nod solemnly at these words. He was a spectacular actor. If I had not spent the last 72 hours tracing his digital footprints through offshore banking portals, I would have believed the fake emotions swimming in his handsome eyes. He squeezed my hands again, radiating a practiced warmth that made my skin crawl. The guests were completely silent, captivated by the beautiful, incredibly expensive illusion we were projecting. I could hear the faint rhythmic clicking of the lead photographer's camera shutter, capturing our perfect profiles. The scent of thousands of imported white orchids was overwhelmingly heavy in the warm air of the ballroom. I kept my breathing slow and completely even, counting the seconds in my head. I knew the traditional wedding liturgy by heart. We were only moments away from the critical explosive juncture. Agent Carter and his undercover team were practically invisible, blending perfectly into the venue's staff, but I could feel their tactical presence securing the perimeter. I glanced quickly into the front row. Sylvia was rigid, her knuckles totally white as she gripped her expensive silver clutch. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred mixed with paralyzing fear. The fraudulent prenuptial agreement was still burning a hole in her mind. She knew something was horribly wrong, but she was trapped by the rigid social expectations of the massive crowd she had invited. She could not cause a scene without destroying the precious Montgomery reputation she had committed so many federal crimes to protect. And now the priest shifted his weight, turning his gaze away from us and looking directly out into the massive sea of elite guests. He raised his hands slightly, signaling the most traditional dramatic moment of the entire ceremony. Before we proceed to the exchanging of the vows, the priest announced, his deep voice carrying a sudden heavy gravity. It is required that I ask this congregation a vital question. If anyone here can show just cause why these two people may not lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The massive ballroom fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. It was the ceremonial pause that usually lasted only 5 seconds. It was the part of the wedding where the guests smiled, the bride and groom shared a relieved, loving glance, and the ceremony moved gracefully forward. Brendan looked at me, his perfect smile widening, fully expecting the priest to continue reading from his heavy leather binder. I did not smile back. Instead, I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands entirely out of his grasp. Brendan blinked, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his face. His hands hovered awkwardly in the empty space between us. Clara, he whispered so quietly only I could hear him. What are you doing? I ignored him completely. I turned away from my panicked groom and took a single confident step toward the priest. I reached out with a steady hand. I need to borrow this for a moment, Father, I said politely, gently, taking the wireless microphone directly from his hand. The priest was too shocked to resist. He stepped back, his eyes wide with utter bewilderment. A loud collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as 300 high society guests simultaneously realized the bride had just hijacked the ceremony. Whispers immediately erupted from the golden chairs. I saw the aggressive commercial real estate developers in the third row leaning forward. I saw the corrupt regional bank managers exchanging nervous, confused glances. In the front row, Sylvia stood up abruptly. Her heavy silver chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. Clara, she barked, her voice shrill and echoing without the microphone. Put that down right now. You are ruining the ceremony. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice boomed through the massive high-definition speakers mounted around the room, instantly drowning out Sylvia's desperate command. I am not ruining anything, Sylvia, I announced smoothly, my tone echoing with cold corporate authority. I am simply following the traditional rules. The priest asked if there was any just cause why this marriage should not proceed, and as the bride, I feel it is my absolute duty to provide a fully documented answer. Brendan stepped toward me, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure panic. Clara, please, he begged softly, reaching out to grab my arm. You are having a panic attack. Let us go to the bridal suite and talk about this. Do not embarrass us in front of everyone. I took a sharp step backward, effectively dodging his grasp. Do not touch me, Brendan, I ordered, my amplified voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. He froze instantly, completely paralyzed by the sheer dominance in my tone. I turned back to face the massive crowd of highly influential guests. When I agreed to marry into the prestigious Montgomery family, I began pacing slowly across the elevated marble platform. I was told that this name represented generational wealth, absolute integrity, and untouchable high society influence. Sylvia Montgomery made it very clear that I needed to understand how true wealth operates. She insisted that I, a simple corporate accountant, needed a brutal masterclass in managing large-scale finances. I paused, letting the heavy words hang in the air. The room was so quiet I could hear the expensive chandelier crystals clinking gently against one another. Jamal was standing in the second row, holding his wife Rebecca firmly by the hand, a look of profound, victorious anticipation on his face. So, as a special wedding gift to my incredible groom and his wonderful mother, I continued, my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of mercy. I decided to use my professional auditing skills to thoroughly examine the Montgomery family legacy. I wanted to present a fully comprehensive financial portfolio to celebrate our new union. I wanted everyone in this room to see exactly how Brendan and Sylvia built their untouchable empire. I turned my head very slightly. I looked directly across the massive room past the sea of shocked faces, past the towering floral arrangements and locked eyes with the audiovisual control booth hidden behind the heavy black curtain. I saw Mark, the young technician I had bribed 30 minutes earlier, standing frozen at the soundboard. I gave him one single sharp nod. For 2 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Brendan let out a nervous, shaky breath, thinking my dramatic stunt had somehow failed. Sylvia started to aggressively push her way out of the front row, clearly intending to physically drag me off the altar. Then the massive high-definition screens positioned directly behind the altar exploded into blinding white light. The sudden illumination cast massive, towering shadows over the entire bridal party. A loud electronic click echoed through the main speakers as the encrypted federal presentation successfully bypassed the venue's standard security firewalls. The light from the screens reflected brilliantly off the polished marble floors, painting Brendan's terrified face in a harsh, unforgiving glow. He slowly turned around to look at the massive screens. The first slide was not a romantic photo montage of our relationship. It was a massive high-resolution scan of a highly classified federal tax lien. In giant bold black letters across the top of the document were the words, "Notice of Imminent Asset Seizure," followed immediately by Sylvia Montgomery's full legal name and the primary address of the country club estate she claimed to own free and clear. The collective gasp from the elite audience was deafening. The execution had officially commenced. The massive LED screens shifted abruptly from the tax lien to a deeply complex organizational chart. I kept the microphone close to my mouth, acting as the completely detached narrator of their absolute destruction. "This is Harbor Consulting Limited," I stated clearly, over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "It is a Delaware shell company created by Brendan and Sylvia to aggressively siphon funds from commercial real estate loans." The screen zoomed in on a specific series of bank transfers. Each transaction flashed in bright crimson red, highlighting the exact moments millions of dollars were illegally diverted into their private offshore accounts. Brendan lunged toward the audiovisual booth, his polished groom facade entirely shattered. "Cut the feed," he screamed, his voice cracking violently. "Cut the damn power right now." But Mark had locked the system just as I instructed. A new slide appeared displaying forged signatures on massive commercial loan documents. I saw the regional bank managers in the third row frantically pulling out their cell phones. Several of the commercial real estate developers were already standing up, their faces flushed with absolute rage as they recognized their own stolen corporate funds projected in high definition. The entire right side of this ballroom erupted into aggressive shouting. Sylvia was hyperventilating, gripping the edges of the altar platform. She looked completely feral, her heavy makeup smearing as she began to sweat profusely. "You lying little snake!" she shrieked, preparing to lunge toward me. Before she could even reach the first marble step, the visual presentation cut to pitch black. A sharp burst of audio static echoed through the main speakers, followed immediately by the crisp, undeniable sound of Brendan's own voice. It was the digital recording I had secretly captured at 4 in the morning inside his private home office. "She is just a stupid accountant, mother." Brendan's recorded voice echoed loudly through the entire ballroom. "We drain the remaining trust fund the minute the marriage certificate is filed. Then I will force her into a psychiatric hold just like we did to Rebecca. Clara will not suspect a single thing until the ink is already dry." Total, unadulterated chaos erupted instantly. The wealthy guests were no longer whispering. They were actively shouting and cursing. Rebecca let out a piercing gasp in the second row, clutching Jamal's arm as the horrifying truth of her own past trauma was publicly validated. Jamal stood tall, his eyes locked on Brendan with cold, vindicated fury. Brendan spun around to face the crowd, holding his hands up in a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain control. "That is a completely fake recording," he yelled frantically over the rising uproar, sweat pouring down his face. "She is trying to extort us." I smiled, lowering the microphone to my side. The massive screens illuminated one final time, displaying the official federal arrest warrants for both Brendan and Sylvia Montgomery, complete with the massive federal seal and the signature of a federal judge. The illusion of the Montgomery Empire was entirely reduced to ash. The massive ballroom instantly transformed from a high society wedding into a chaotic crime scene. The corrupt regional bank managers in the third row began aggressively shoving each other, desperately trying to flee the room before they were legally implicated in the massive financial conspiracy. Brendan stared at the federal warrants glowing brightly on the screens above him, his pristine groom persona entirely fracturing. He whipped his head around, his panicked eyes frantically searching the massive crowd for a clear path to the emergency exit. He took one desperate step off the marble platform, but his escape was completely blocked. Jamal stepped directly into the center aisle. He did not say a single word. He simply raised his right hand and gave a sharp, decisive nod to the undercover agent posing as the venue sommelier. The sommelier instantly dropped his white towel, revealing a heavy gold federal badge pinned securely to his belt. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The agent bellowed, his voice cutting through the massive uproar like a physical blade. Suddenly, the entire venue perimeter collapsed inward. The floral designer near the coat check unzipped her uniform jacket, drawing a heavy tactical belt. The fake security guards stationed at the side doors pushed past the frantic, screaming guests, aggressively storming the center aisle. Agent Carter led the primary breach team straight through the grand double doors, marching down the mirrored aisle with his weapon drawn and his eyes locked directly on the altar. Brendan, realizing he was completely surrounded, spun back toward me. His face was twisted in pure, desperate rage. "You set me up!" he screamed, lunging forward with his hands outstretched. Before he could even cross the marble platform, Agent Carter tackled him violently to the floor. The heavy impact shook the massive floral arrangement, sending hundreds of white rose petals raining down over Brendan's custom-tailored tuxedo. He thrashed wildly, screaming absolute obscenities, but two more heavily armed agents pinned his shoulders down, forcing his wrists behind his back with brutal efficiency. The cold metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the microphone still lying near my feet. Sylvia did not try to run. She was entirely frozen in the front row, completely incapable of processing the catastrophic destruction of her massive financial empire. When a female agent approached her and calmly recited her Miranda rights, Sylvia completely snapped. She swung her heavy silver clutch, wildly striking the agent squarely in the shoulder. "Do not touch me!" Sylvia shrieked, her expensive updo unraveling as she fought against the restraining hands. "I am Sylvia Montgomery. I own half of this damn city. You have absolutely no right to do this to my family." Her frantic screams were completely useless. The female agent smoothly deflected her next blow, spun her around, and slammed her aggressively against the gold Chiavari chair. Handcuffs snapped tightly around her heavily manicured wrists. "Brendan Montgomery and Sylvia Montgomery," Agent Carter announced loudly, projecting his voice over the terrified murmurs of the elite crowd. "You are both under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive corporate tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." I stood perfectly still on the elevated altar, my heavy white silk gown completely untouched by the massive physical struggle occurring just feet away. I looked down at Brendan, who was currently being dragged roughly to his feet by his expensive lapels. His face was bruised, his offshore accounts were frozen, and his absolute freedom was permanently revoked. I watched the agents march him aggressively down the mirrored aisle, right past the terrified faces of the very high society elite he had tried so desperately to impress. Jamal wrapped his arm protectively around Rebecca, allowing her to watch her abusers finally face absolute justice. The trap had fully snapped shut. The heavy oak doors swung shut at the far end of the mirrored aisle, temporarily muting Brendan's pathetic, frantic screams. Inside the grand ballroom, the 300 elite guests were completely frozen in a state of absolute shock. The aggressive commercial real estate developers and corrupt regional bank managers quickly realized they were entirely trapped. Federal agents moved methodically through the aisles, aggressively locking down the emergency exits and beginning the massive operational process of confiscating cell phones and identifying known co-conspirators. The lavish million-dollar wedding reception had officially become a massive federal holding pen. I remained standing on the elevated marble altar. My pulse was remarkably steady. I watched the absolute destruction of high society with the cold, detached satisfaction of a senior corporate auditor closing a perfectly balanced ledger. The priest was trembling violently in the corner, clutching his heavy leather binder against his chest, as if it could physically protect him from the federal raid. I smiled at him warmly, reached into the deep pocket hidden inside the heavy silk layers of my custom designer gown, and pulled out one final perfectly folded legal document. I stepped gracefully over the scattered white rose petals, walked directly over to the trembling priest, and gently placed the document on the marble altar. It was a certified bank foreclosure and immediate eviction notice for the massive Montgomery family estate. I had personally purchased their heavily defaulted mortgage through a blind corporate trust 2 days ago, using my own legitimate assets. By midnight tonight, the massive iron gates of their prestigious country club mansion would be securely padlocked by the local county sheriff. Their fraudulent empire was not just dismantled, it was completely erased from the map. I turned my back on the altar and began my final walk down the mirrored aisle. The massive sea of influential guests instinctively parted for me. The wealthy socialites who had spent the entire last year loudly mocking my working-class background were now staring at the heavy silk of my wedding dress with pure, unfiltered terror. They pressed themselves firmly against the golden Chiavari chairs, desperate to avoid making any direct eye contact with the woman who had just publicly executed the most powerful family in their elite social circle. I did not offer them a single glance of pity. They were parasites, and their host was entirely dead. I stopped briefly in the second row. Jamal and Rebecca were standing quietly, completely surrounded by the absolute chaos of the federal lockdown. Rebecca was crying softly, but they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. The heavy, invisible psychological chains Sylvia had wrapped around her mind were permanently shattered. Jamal looked at me, his sharp eyes reflecting a deep, unshakable respect for the massive tactical operation I had just successfully concluded. "It is completely over, Jamal," I said softly, my voice calm and completely clear, despite the shouting federal agents in the background. "The massive legal firewall we built around your family business is entirely secure. The authorities have the encrypted drive with every single forged document Brendan ever signed. Rebecca is finally safe." Jamal reached out and firmly squeezed my hand. "You did exactly what you promised Clara. You burned their entire legacy straight to the ground." I nodded gracefully. "There is a massive, fully catered caviar and champagne reception set up in the next room," I told them, allowing a genuine warm smile to finally cross my face. "The venue has already been fully paid in cash. You should stay and enjoy the incredibly expensive food. I have a private ride waiting outside." I continued walking down the mirrored aisle, my heavy heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I pushed through the grand double doors, leaving the frantic shouting and the aggressive federal interrogations entirely behind me. The grand foyer of the luxury hotel was eerily quiet. The venue coordinators were huddled tightly together near the coat check, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes as I smoothly glided past them in my pristine white gown. I pushed through the massive gold revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool air of the city. The long red carpet was still rolled out, but the massive, stretched limousine was completely gone. In its place was a sleek black town car, its engine purring quietly near the curb. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the fresh city air fill my lungs. The suffocating heavy scent of Sylvia's imported white lilies was finally gone forever. As the town car driver rushed forward to open the rear passenger door for me, I paused for a single moment and looked up at the bright, clear sky. I thought deeply about my Nana Rose. I thought about the decades she spent scrubbing floors, saving every single dollar she earned in a rusted tin can, desperately fighting to build a solid financial foundation for her family. She used to tell me that wealth was not about expensive clothes or flashy cars. She said true wealth was the absolute freedom to walk away from toxic people who tried to diminish your light. She built her legacy with raw sweat and undeniable grit. Sylvia and Brendan had mistaken my quiet, polite demeanor for absolute weakness. They looked at my modest background and saw an incredibly easy target. They truly believed they could steal my grandmother's hard-earned legacy to cover up their massive corporate crimes. But they severely underestimated the profound difference between old money arrogance and working-class survival. I did not just survive their predatory attacks. I aggressively dissected their entire fraudulent existence, engineered a flawless legal trap, and forced them to broadcast their own spectacular demise to everyone they ever respected. I gathered the heavy silk layers of my beautiful, completely untarnished wedding gown and slid gracefully into the dark leather interior of the town car. The driver closed the heavy door, immediately shutting out the loud approaching sirens of the city police cruisers. I leaned back into the comfortable seat, pulling out my cell phone to check my secure offshore accounts. The massive trust fund was perfectly intact, earning a steady compounding interest. "Take me directly to the airport," I instructed the driver quietly. I was officially a runaway bride, but I was absolutely not running from a tragedy. I was calmly walking away from a perfectly executed financial assassination. The Montgomery family thought they were playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess. They just never realized I was the one actively controlling the entire board. The massive city skyline rolled past the tinted windows as the car accelerated away from the luxury hotel. I locked my phone, closed my eyes, and finally allowed myself to truly rest. The ruthless audit was officially complete.